The free and enslaved Black people living in Washington, D.C. in the early 19th century built a thriving community of schools, churches, businesses, and charitable organizations. The success of this community led to fear among white Washingtonians as they felt white supremacy slipping away. The tensions between white and Black Washingtonians finally boiled over one August night in 1835. It began at the house of Anna Thornton on F Street between 13th and 14th Street. Anna Thornton was a well-known and influential figure of Washington, D.C. society. That night, 18-year-old Arthur Bowen, a Black man owned by Miss Thornton, stood swaying in her doorway, intoxicated with an axe in the crook of his arm. Mr. Bowen had been in a meeting that night of a debating society of free Black men. Bowen's pain, frustration, and anger towards a society that refused to see him as more than a commodity went unfiltered that evening, thanks to the alcohol. And the result was his picking up an axe on the way to Miss Thornton's private bedroom and yelling, "I've got just as much right to freedom as you." After the door was slammed in his face by his mother, Maria, who slept in the room with Miss Thornton, Maria screamed for her son to get out, perhaps quickly understanding what his fate could be if he stayed near the house for too long. 3 days later, this notice for Mr. Bowen's capture was posted in the National Intelligencer newspaper by Miss Thornton. From this notice, we learn that Mr. Bowen ran into the night without his shoes, hat, or jacket. We also learn that he spoke, quote, civilly and, quote, softly, in Miss Thornton's opinion. Bowen somehow found refuge for the next 5 days, but was eventually caught by police and thrown in the city jail, circled here in red in the middle of what is known today as Judiciary Square. News of Bowen's outburst had traveled quickly through the city of Washington, D.C., especially among the white working class, referred to as mechanics at this time. These men formed a mob and descended upon the jail, out for blood. Unable to get to Bowen, however, they set their sights on a man they decided represented all abolitionists, or people who believed in ending the practice of slavery. His name was Reuben Crandall. This is a portrait of Reuben Crandall's sister, Prudence Crandall, who was in fact an outspoken abolitionist. Reuben Crandall, however, did not concern himself with issues of abolition. Nevertheless, books and pamphlets from abolitionist groups were found at Crandall's office. Thus, Francis Scott Key called for his arrest. With Bowen and Crandall now in jail, the mob moved on to Black restaurant owner Beverly Snow. Snow owned and operated the Epicurean Eating House, circled here in red at 6th and Pennsylvania Avenue. As Chris Myers Ash and George Derek Musgrove state in their book Chocolate City, A History of Race and Democracy in the Nation's Capital, Snow was, quote, the purveyor of perhaps the most luxurious food in town. Snow was educated, prosperous, and perhaps a touch condescending. He was rumored to have boasted that he could get any mechanic's wife or daughter as he pleased. Luckily, Snow was tipped off to the mob by white friends and was able to leave town before the mob destroyed his beloved restaurant. The mob quickly moved on, however, to vandalize John F. Cook's School for Black Students, circled here in red on the corner of 14th and H Street. Cook also narrowly escaped the mob's violence. Just across the street from the scene at the Epicurean Eating House sat the National Hotel, built and owned by John Gadsby, who, in a matter of months, would be the new owner of the Decatur House. 39 enslaved and 4 free individuals worked at the National Hotel, according to the 1830 census. Perhaps some of them were in bed at the time, or tending to guests. Perhaps they stole away to the windows to watch the violence taking place across the street. Or maybe they whispered rumors of Snow to one another while passing in the hallways. We know of at least 9 individuals who moved from the National Hotel to the Decatur House with Gadsby when he bought it as his retirement home. Their names were Henry, Maria, Celia, Charles, and Sarah Jane King, William, Maria, and Martha Williams, and Nancy Syphax. This means Miss Syphax and the King and Williams families were living and working at the Decatur House a year later when Beverly Snow returned to Washington, D.C. to tie up business ends. An article in the National Intelligencer recounted how a group of white men followed Snow to the corner of Penn and 11th, where he turned and ran to F Street and attempted to hide from the men in a churchyard. Snow elected to go to jail as the large crowd that had formed was so angry and volatile he feared for his safety. After forcing Snow to pay a debt, the magistrates ruled Snow could not be charged with any criminal offense, but he was told he needed to leave the city as soon as possible and never return. The events of the Snow Riot represented the deeply rooted racism and hatred toward not only Black people, but the idea of Black community and success. The mob of white working class men were frustrated by low wages and poor working conditions and blamed the Black workers for this. Instead of working with their Black counterparts to fight for better treatment from the upper class for all workers, deeply rooted racism led them to believe they deserved better than Black people. As stated once again by Chris Myers Ash and George Derek Musgrove in their book Chocolate City, A History of Race and Democracy in the Nation's Capital, quote, politically impotent, economically dependent, socially subordinated white workers raged at the upper class, but they chose to use violence against the only groups more degraded than they, Black people and their abolitionist allies.